Hello folks, my name is Mark. This is Why I Hate the World, my peoples, where you at? So I want to do something a little bit different this stream. We're going to talk about Swiftboating. Now, you may have heard this term pop up recently in relation to Governor Tim Walz when he was announced to run as Kamala Harris's running mate for this election. And he immediately, as soon as he announced and the news of him got out, that he was going to be the running mate, he immediately got swift-boated, just like within 24 hours. Now, what exactly does swift-boating mean? It's a term that has come to describe the phenomenon where the Republicans will attack a Democratic candidate on the basis of his military record. And it doesn't matter what that service record is. It doesn't matter anything about any particulars about where they were deployed, if they were deployed, if they had any complaints or reprimands or anything like that. Doesn't matter. They will instantly attack their military record, try to claim that they are somehow faking it and that it's all stolen valor and all that, and that they're really communist traitors or whatever who hate the country. Because the right wing in this country likes to pretend that they're the only people who are allowed to be patriots. So when you have a Democrat that actually serves in the military in any capacity, they have to somehow diminish that so that their people can live with this delusion that they're the only people who are actually patriots or whatever. They're the only people who actually love America. And every single Democrat or progressive or liberal is a commie traitor who wants to destroy the country. That's essentially what swiftboating is. And that's exactly what happened to Tim Walz. So those of you who don't pay attention to this kind of thing, Tim Walz was in the Minnesota National Guard for 24 years. He seems to have an exemplary military record. Doesn't seem to have any types of complaints or punishments or reprimands or anything like that on his record at all. Seems to be essentially spotless. And he retired in May of 2005. Here, the attack comes in this way. In July of 2005, his unit got orders to deploy to Iraq. So J.D. Vance has decided to attack Tim Walz on his military record by claiming that he somehow had a crystal ball and was able to tell the future and knew that he was going to be deployed in July and then somehow arranged it so that he could retire before that happened because Tim Walz is a coward who hates America. That's the attack that we're getting from J.D. Vance in regards to Tim Walz's military record. But here's the actual truth about all this, right? So the problem is, in order to retire, one has to submit their paperwork to do so 5 to 7 months ahead of time. So that means that Tim Walz submitted his paperwork to retire in November of 2004, and the latest he could have done so was in January of 2005. However, his unit didn't know that they were going to be mobilized to ship out until March of 2005. So somehow Tim Walz was able to, I don't know, maybe he has a DeLorean, with a flux capacitor in his garage. Maybe he's got a TARDIS hanging out in his backyard. Maybe, I don't know, a hot tub time machine, something like that. Somehow he was able to go into the future and see that he was going to be deployed a year later, and so then went back in time before his unit got the message that they were going to be deployed and put in his paperwork to retire from the National Guard, which, keep in mind, he had served in for 24 years without any incident. That is a classic example of swiftboating because, see, a 24-year service record is generally a positive thing. People like it when their politicians serve in the military. It's a good way to show that, hey, I'm a patriot, I love this country, I served for this country in this capacity or that capacity, and whatever armed forces you served in. It's a good thing to put on a resume when you want to become a governor or a president. And like I said, the Republicans just can't handle that because to them, to their worldview, only they are allowed to be patriots. They have to find any instance where their Democratic opponent is also patriotic and somehow turn that against them. So that's exactly what happened to Tim Walz. And it is, of course, complete bullshit. So this phenomenon, where the Republicans lie about the military record of their political opponents, is nothing new. It is called Swiftboating and has been going on for decades. Okay, so the term Swiftboating comes from 2004. Specifically, it was coined in relation to John Kerry, when John Kerry was the Democratic nominee for president in 2004. And that term, Swiftboat, is slang for a Navy class of vessel, of which John Kerry was the commander of. So in Vietnam, he served from 1966 to 1971. And then afterwards, John Kerry went on to become an anti-war activist. And this is where the main attack came from. The main attacks that the Republicans had against John Kerry was during his activism phase. But the thing about John Kerry is that he was the real deal. He was actually in combat. He actually had to fight and kill people. So during his term in Vietnam, he received 2 Purple Hearts, which means that he was wounded twice. One time by shrapnel. An enemy boat was destroyed. He got hit by some shrapnel. And then a second time when his boat that he was on was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade and more shrapnel hit him. He later earned a Silver Star, which is the 3rd highest medal in the armed forces. And that was when he was in command and ordered his boats to charge enemy positions on the Duan Kio River. And what happened was that they were taking fire, and there was a VC, like Viet Cong guy, and he had a RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, and he jumped up out of this spider hole and ran away, and the boats were chasing him and firing. And John Kerry jumped out of his boat, chased this guy down, shot him, and captured his rocket-propelled grenade. Like, he captured his RPG. This guy's the real fucking thing. And then later on, he got a Bronze Star, and he got this because they were in the boats, and a mine blew up underneath his boat, which injured him. He basically slammed up against this bulkhead and injured his arm. And there was a Green Beret guy, like advisor. His name was James Rassman, and this explosion caused James Rassman to fly overboard. Then they were taking fire by snipers. So while this advisor guy is in the water and John Kerry's arm was injured and snipers were shooting at them, he dove into the water and rescued this guy, pulled him back up onto the boat with an injured arm while snipers are firing at him. So yeah, John Kerry was the real deal. Whether you like him or not, whether you voted for him or not, whatever, whether you think he's a liar or a coward or whatever, he was the real fucking thing. He was out there actually fighting in the jungle and putting his life on line and getting shot at by snipers and fucking rockets and shit like that. And so yeah, so you can talk all the shit you want about John Kerry, but his actual military service record is like fucking crazy if you read about it. Like, the shit this guy did was nuts. And he, of course, got attacked because after he came back from Vietnam, he became an anti-war activist. So he comes back in 1971. And he took part in what was called the Winter Soldier investigation. Pretty crazy stuff, where they investigated essentially war crimes that the United States committed in Vietnam. Things like villagers being shot when they're surrendering and people being used as target practice, shit like that. And yeah, those things happened. A lot of conservatives will try to gaslight you into saying that all this is all lies and we never did. No, these types of war crimes happened in Vietnam. And John Kerry was out there speaking against this stuff. And he later got arrested during a march in 1971. So all of the allegations against him, many of them came from this period after he came back from Vietnam, calling him a lefty, calling him a commie and shit like that. So later, when he runs for office in 2004, this group of conservative vets, they form a pack called the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth. They started airing these ads on TV calling John Kerry a traitor, saying he went AWOL, saying that he hates the country and blah, 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 and that he sold his country out and all this other shit like that. And this is a guy that remembers got 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star and a Bronze Star for fucking basically like being a fucking hero, saving people's lives and shit. They became known as Swiftboaties, right? These guys, the Swiftboat fucking veterans for truth or whatever, basically shit all over his record, and that in no small part contributed to a John Kerry loss, because people don't like it when veterans come out and say that you're a traitor. The thing about all this is that it was mostly bullshit. They took things that he did during his protesting after the war and blew them wildly out of proportion. Things like that, calling him a commie, calling him a traitor, saying that he turned people in and shit like that, and he didn't do anything like that. And then also trying to claim that he, didn't actually earn the medals that he earned. And most of the people who served with John Kerry have gone on record saying that the allegations from the Swiftboaters are bullshit. Most of them. I mean, it's pretty, it's kind of fucking despicable. And so that has become the term Swiftboating. Comes from these assholes, these Swiftboat veterans for truth who threw John Kerry under the bus because he ran for president as a Democrat. Keep in mind, if John Kerry ran as a Republican, these assholes would have been there kissing his fucking feet, making advertisements about what a fucking hero he is. It's all political. It's got no fucking basis in truth whatsoever. And we can say that because George W. Bush, who was the president at the time, has a somewhat dodgy military record himself. Little bit, I mean, it's a little bit relevant, so we'll kind of do a brief explanation. George W. Bush was accused of using his rich daddy's money and political connections into getting him assigned into the Texas National Guard so that he would be exempt from getting drafted into going into Vietnam. And then there's allegations about how he never showed up, how he would show up drunk, stuff like that. And these basically blew up in the face of investigators. There was some documents which turned out to be forged in relation to his military record and in relation to his attendance record specifically. And that essentially ruined the career of Dan Rather. Because, folks, back in the day, when you were a journalist and you were reported on a story that turned out to not be true, that was the end of your career. It destroyed Dan Rather because he went to bat for this story, and it turned out that these documents turned out to be bullshit. And even though there was testimony from people and stuff saying that, George W. Bush really was kind of a screw-up, didn't show up and all this other shit, would show up drunk and shit like that, even though there was testimony from people in his unit that would attest to these things, the actual documents that they got saying that his attendance record was screwy turned out to be forgeries. And so it essentially destroyed Dan Rather, and he retired in shame. And yeah, it's kind of amazing when you think about it to see that, back then, and this was 20 years ago, that it's kind of amazing to see that 20 years ago, reporting on a story that turns out to be false could destroy you. Whereas nowadays, we have entire networks that do nothing but spread lies constantly. And they get away with it scot-free. It's like, Dan Rather, if you just would have hung in there a few more years, you would have been fine. So anyway, but there's the thing. It's like, well, George W. Bush's record was all fucked up, but the Swiftboat Veterans for Truth didn't give a fuck about that because he was, of course, a Republican. So that's what you got to remember about all this. Every time they do this to a Democrat, it has nothing to do with the actual record. It has nothing to do with the actual truth. It is all 100% political because these people are partisan dickheads. And it gets ridiculous sometimes. So in 2002, there was a guy named Max Cleland, and he was running for re-election as the U.S. Senator from Georgia. And shortly before Election Day, his Republican opponent, his name was Senator Saxby Chambliss. This guy runs an ad using imagery of Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, trying to claim that this guy Max Cleland was in support of terrorism. And it was because Max Cleland voted against the bill that formed the Department of Homeland Security. Here's the thing about this, right? Max Cleland not only served in Vietnam, he also was injured and had both of his legs amputated from below the knee and also his right arm at the elbow. So Max Cleland not only saw combat, but was previously injured in a life-changing way, a debilitating life-changing way. Yet these assholes turn around and claim that he's a traitor because he is, of course, the Democrat. And here's the thing about all this, right? His opponent, the guy that did this, the guy that ran this shifty fucking disgusting ad, named Saxy Chambliss, in Vietnam, he got a student deferment. See, back in the day, when they used to draft people, they would make deferments, reasons why you don't have to get drafted. And one of those was that, well, if you're in college, then you don't get drafted. So this guy, Saxy Chambliss, got to not go to Vietnam. He got to go to school instead. And he's not the only one. You know, Dick Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president, he got 5 draft determinants. Okay. He got 2 of them, 2 student determinants, because he went to college for 6 years instead of 4 for some reason. So he got 2 student determinants. Then they said, okay, after he got out of school, there was a determinant for men who were married. So he gets married as soon as he gets out of school. Then they announced that, okay, married men are going to start getting drafted. But if you have a child, then you can get a determinant for that. He has his first child 9 months and 2 days after that announcement. Okay, so that's number 4. Then when they said, okay, we're going to get married men with children, but if you have dependents, if you're the sole breadwinner, then you don't get drafted. And he got his final determinant for that. Then he turns 26, and then they can't draft him anymore. That's fucking Dick Cheney, who did like every fucking thing possible to avoid going to Vietnam there, right? Who would later go on and help us drop bombs on Iraq and Afghanistan. It was totally fucking fine with that. Donald Trump, of course, very famously got a medical determinant for his bone spurs. Can't forget that. He couldn't go fight because his bone spurs were all fucked up and he can't walk or whatever. That, of course, doesn't stop Donald Trump from golfing 5 fucking days a week. Right? So, obviously, the bone spurs aren't that fucking bad. If he can, like, walk all that distance and swing a golf club, oh well, I guess the doctors know better. J.D. Vance, of course, did go to Iraq. But he went as a military journalist for 6 months. He was never in combat. He essentially had a cushy desk job the whole time that he was there. He was not checking out spider holes and kicking down doors looking for terrorists. And that really just seems to be the pattern for years and years and years. Every time you have a Republican who runs for office, it always turns out that they either got a deferment from fighting or that they had some kind of cushy desk job, that they were never in there in the center of the shit, whatever. And every time a Democrat who actually did serve, no matter what that service is, they shit all over it. They turn it into an attack against them. Because, once again, the Republicans like to claim that they're the only people who are allowed to be patriotic. They're the only people who are allowed to love America. And it really comes down to this, folks. Politicians are the ruling class. Okay, they just are. It will always be the case that only people who have access to wealth and power will also be able to become the leaders in this country. And really, the Democrats are the junior party when it comes to that. The Republicans are the super rich elite. The Democrats are the people who are elite but may have come from more humble backgrounds. And that's the way it is. That's the way it always has been. And when it comes to military service, this is reflected in there as well. Republicans tend to either not be in the military, or when they're in the military, they're in positions of power. They don't really tend to end up in the line of fire. They're either in command, or they've used their connections to tuck themselves away someplace to where they'll be safe. Whereas Democrats tend to come from a more working class background. They're more often within the line of fire when it comes to their military service. And that's just how it is. And the Republicans have spent a long amount of time framing this narrative that Democrats aren't allowed to be patriots. And it's complete 100% bullshit. So just remember that when you pull that lever this November, Just remember, the people that are actually telling you that war is good are never the fucking people that actually fight in wars themselves. Hello folks, if you like what I do and you want to support the channel, please consider buying something from my Etsy shop, supporting me on Patreon, liking and subscribing, and checking me out across my social media links listed below. Thank you all so much, and see you next time.